Yo, what is up, guys? It is Schultz31 back with a brand new video. Today we are going to be discussing the 15 most disappointing college football teams from 2021. Please subscribe to my channel and click the notification button as you'll be notified whenever I upload a new video. It helps a lot. Like I said, all 15 of these teams had high expectations going into 2021, but failed miserably. At number 15, I have Penn State. Back in 2020, Penn State started out the year in a weird COVID year, 0-5. However, they would finish out hot, winning their last 4 games, finishing the year 4-5. Going into 2021, there was a ton of hype around Penn State football. As like I said, they finished out the season hot in 2020. And in 2021, they would start out hot, starting the year 5-0, with wins over Wisconsin, Ball State, Auburn, Villanova, and a shutout win over Indiana. But would then lose to Iowa, and then would lose to Illinois, and then would get beat by number 6 Ohio State. They did beat Maryland, and almost beat number 3 Michigan, and shut out Rutgers 28-0. But then would lose to Michigan State, and would then lose to Arkansas in the Outback Bowl, finishing the year 7-6. To be fair, Penn State really did have a brutal schedule, having to play several ranked teams, and 3 top 10 teams and 2 top 5 teams. However, this still was a very disappointing season in comparison to what everyone had thought. But that's why I have them at number 15, because they had such a brutal schedule. At number 14, I have LSU. Ever since the Tigers won the national championship back in 2018, they just haven't seemed to have been able to get over the hump. In 2020, they had regressed tremendously, but they did improve towards the end of the season, beating a ranked Florida team. Many people thought the Tigers would improve with how impressive they looked late in the year. However, this was not the case. They once again struggled in 2021, and Ed Orgeron was fired midway through the season. However, he was able to coach the team for the rest of the season, and they did end up beating Texas A&M late in the season to clinch bowl eligibility, finishing the regular season 6-6, but would then lose to Kansas State in the Texas Bowl, finishing the year 6-7 overall, which was LSU's first losing season in 21 years. LSU does have a bright future though, with new head coach Brian Kelly coming in from Notre Dame. However, this was still a very disappointing season for the Tigers. At number 13, I have Nebraska. Many people this year thought that this would finally be the year Scott Frost's Nebraska Cornhuskers finally got over the hump and made a bowl game. However, just like many of the years previous, they had a horrible 3-9 season. To be fair though, they did have a brutal schedule. To start the year off, they had an embarrassing loss to Illinois. However, they bounced back the following week, as they did have blowout wins over both Fordham and Buffalo. Although these were easy wins, they were still a major step in the right direction as they were now 2-1. But then they would lose in a close game to number 10 Oklahoma, and then would lose in a heartbreaker to number 9 Michigan State. But then they ended up killing Northwestern 56-7, which was unbelievable, as no one was expecting that. But then they would lose their last 6 games. However, they were very competitive in all of those games, almost beating number 3 Michigan and almost beating a ranked Iowa team. But still, this was still a disappointing season for the Cornhuskers. But in my opinion, they should be improved in 2022. At number 12, I have Northwestern. After winning the Big Ten West in the weird year of 2020 with COVID, going 6-1, many people thought the Wildcats would once again do well in 2021. However, that was not the case, as the Wildcats went 3-9 and had terrible quarterback play all year long. In the season opener, the Wildcats got blown out by Michigan State 38-21. And then after an easy win over Indiana State, Northwestern would then go on the road and lose to Duke. But then after an easy blowout win over Ohio, Northwestern would get killed by Nebraska 56-7. I mean, Nebraska was terrible. They went 3-9, had ironically the exact same record that Northwestern had, but they beat the rails off of the Wildcats. They would come back and beat Rutgers pretty good, 21-7. However, the following week, they would once again get blown out by Michigan. And then they would get blown out by Minnesota the following week. And then would lose in a close game to a ranked Iowa team before getting blown out in their last 3 games of the season. It really was a disappointing season for Northwestern in 2021. An embarrassing one at that. Going from being the best team in their division the year before to being the worst team in their division this year. Up next, I have Missouri. Missouri, in my opinion, going into this season, was one of the most overhyped teams in college football. There was a ton of hype surrounding the Tigers going into 2021 after their somewhat success in 2020 as they started the year 5-3 before losing their last 3 games in the weird year of COVID in 2020. There was a ton of hype surrounding the Tigers going into 2021, although I was a bit skeptical myself, along with many other critics. They started the season off with a win over Central Michigan and lost to Kentucky the following week before blowing out Southeastern Missouri, before then losing to Boston College and then getting killed by Tennessee. Then they would barely beat North Texas and would get blown out by Texas A&M before beating Vanderbilt, and then got killed by number 1 Georgia before clinching bowl eligibility with wins over South Carolina and Florida. They would then, however, get blown out by Arkansas in their rivalry game before losing to Army in the Armed Forces Bowl, finishing the year 6-7. Like I said, the reason why I have these guys at number 11 is because a lot of people saw this coming. There were a lot of people, not just me, who were real skeptical about the Missouri hype. If anything, they were the team that everyone knew would probably be the most disappointing out of all the teams that had high expectations and failed. Next up at number 10, I have Auburn. After Gus Malzahn was fired for going 6-5 in 2020, Auburn decided to hire Boise State head coach Brian Harsin. It looked like a good hire. Many people thought he would finally develop Bo Nix and would bring Auburn football back to its glory days. I was somewhat skeptical of the hire, but there were still a lot of things that I liked about it. However, it was questionable him hiring South Carolina offensive coordinator Mike Bobo, who had one of the worst offenses in the SEC, as South Carolina's offensive coordinator. However, many people thought he could develop Bo Nix into the superstar he was. Brian Harsin's Auburn Tigers would start the season strong, starting out 6-2, and were ranked, and beat a ranked Arkansas team and a ranked Ole Miss team back-to-back weeks. However, they would lose their last 4 games of the regular season to Texas A&M, Mississippi State, South Carolina, and Alabama, finishing the regular season 6-6, and then losing to Houston in the Birmingham Bowl. It was overall a very disappointing season for the Auburn Tigers. Despite not having high expectations, they still did start the season 6-2 and were ranked. Going from that to then finishing the regular season at a disappointing 6-6 record and then losing in their bowl game to finish out 6-7 in Brian Harsin's first year as the head coach. And to make matters worse, there has been a ton of stuff going on with Brian Harsin and a former Boise State staff member that he brought with him to Auburn. However, it looks like Auburn will still keep him as their head coach going into 2022. In my opinion, Auburn should have never fired Gus Malzahn. Gus Malzahn had them winning. He was able to beat Alabama and was a thorn in their side. Gus Malzahn took them to a national championship, and ironically, the year before he was fired, beat Alabama and eliminated them from the college football playoffs for the first time since the playoffs had begun, and had one down year in a weird year of COVID. At number 9, I have Texas A&M. After last year, when the Aggies went 10-1 with the win over North Carolina in the Orange Bowl and had an incredible season, there was a ton of hype for Texas A&M football going into 2021. And they started the year out 3-0 with an easy win over Kent State, a close win against Colorado, and a shutout win over New Mexico. However, number 10 Arkansas would expose them, beating them 20-10, and then they would lose to Mississippi State the following week and fell out of the rankings. However, they managed to upset number 2 Alabama the following week on a last-second field goal, and then they would end up blowing out Missouri, South Carolina, and Auburn, winning their next 3, going from 3-2 to 6-2. However, Ole Miss would then put them back in their place, beating Texas A&M 29-19. And then after an easy win over Prairie View, Texas A&M got upset by LSU in the last game of the regular season, losing to Ed Orgeron in his last ever game coaching college football, finishing the regular season 8-4. But overall, that would be their final record, as they unfortunately would not get to play in their bowl game due to COVID. This definitely was not a bad year for Texas A&M, but it was still disappointing nonetheless in comparison to what everyone had hoped. Up next, I have Southern Cal. Going into last season, Southern Cal, like all the other teams on this list, had high expectations, but Clay Helton was on the hot seat going into 2021. In week 2, after a 1-1 start to the 2021 season, Southern Cal finally decided to part ways with Clay Helton as he was fired after the Trojans' upset loss to Stanford. Despite blowing out Washington State the following week, they would then take their first loss to Oregon State at home since 1960. However, they would blow out Colorado, but would then lose to Utah, and would then lose to Notre Dame the following week. And then they barely snuck past Arizona at home, a team that hadn't won a game in 2 years at that point. And then they would go on the road the following week and lose to Arizona State. And then they would get blown out by rival UCLA. They would almost beat number 19 BYU. However, the following week, they would lose on the road to rival Cal 24-14. Despite Southern Cal being ranked number 14 at the beginning of the season, they would finish the year 4-8, missing a bowl game. At number 7, I have the Clemson Tigers. Since 2015, the Clemson Tigers have been on top of the college football world, with it all starting with their national championship appearance in 2015 and then winning the national championship in 2016, and then making the college football playoffs in 2017 before once again winning the national championship in 2018, blowing out Alabama, and then making their 5th consecutive college football playoff appearance in 2019, once again making the national championship before getting beat by LSU, and then making the playoffs again in 2020 before getting blown out by Ohio State. Nobody thought 2021 would be any different. Despite losing quarterback Trevor Lawrence to the NFL draft, many people thought that 5-star DJ Uiagalelei coming out of California would be just as good. He played well in the 2 games where Trevor Lawrence was out with COVID, and many people thought he would be the next great Clemson quarterback. Going into the season, the Tigers were ranked number 3 in the country and were expected to to make the playoff like they were every single year. However, in week 1, they would get exposed against number 5 Georgia, losing that game 10-3. Clemson's offense struggled and did not score at all, and this pretty much showed everyone how the Tigers were going to be in 2021. And then after an easy win over South Carolina State, Clemson would struggle and barely beat a terrible 3-9 Georgia Tech team, only winning that game 14-8. Then Clemson would go on the road and get upset by NC State, which eliminated them from the college football playoffs. Clemson would have terrible quarterback play all year long, as DJ Uiagalelei turned out to be a bust and did not play as well as he had in the 2 games the year before. Despite the rough start, the Tigers would finish out their last 2 games of the regular season strong, blowing out ranked Wake Forest and shutting out in-state rival South Carolina. It would make the Cheez-It Bowl against Iowa State. However, they would struggle in that game, but would still end up winning 20-13. Finishing the year overall at a 10-3 record, finishing ranked number 24 in the country. Despite the fact that the Tigers did, pretty much finish with a pretty good season with 10 wins, and finished ranked, and were a lot better than overall most of the other teams on this list, but still, their expectations before the season began were a lot higher than this. And right now, the future of Clemson football seems to be uncertain, as they've lost both their defense coordinator Brent Venables and their offensive coordinator Tony Elliott. And their replacements are, quite questionable. At number 6, I have Washington. The Washington Huskies were ranked the 20th best team in the country going into the 2021 college football season. No, nobody thought they would make the playoffs, let alone win a national championship, but many people thought they would be one of the better teams in the Pac-12 and push Oregon in their division. However, in week 1, they got beat by Montana, an FCS school, 13-7. It was embarrassing how they could only score 1 touchdown against an FCS team. And then the following week, they got killed on the road by number 3 Michigan. And just like that, they were now 0-2. Then they were able to bounce back with an easy win over Arkansas State and then beating Cal. However, they still finished the season at 4-8 with a blowout loss to Washington State at the end of the year. And unfortunately, the future of Washington football isn't looking so good either. Number 5, Indiana. Historically, Indiana is one of the worst college football programs in the history of college football. However, the last 2 years, through 2019 and 2020, Tom Allen has managed to turn them around. In 2019, they went 8-5, and in 2020, they had a great 6-2 season, and it looked like Tom Allen was turning Indiana football around. Going into 2021, the Hoosiers were ranked, and no, they were not expected to make the college football playoffs or contend for a national championship or anything, but they were expected to be a contender in the Big Ten East and make some noise and make a pretty good bowl game. Instead, that did not happen. The Hoosiers went 2-10 and had terrible quarterback play all year long. And as many bad football teams that Indiana has had, this is actually probably one of the worst in school history, which says a lot. I really hated to see Indiana football come crashing down because I was enjoying seeing this dead program rise. It's always fun watching those historically terrible programs become good and make a lot of noise and be one of the better teams in their conference. Speaking of which, up next on the list, Iowa State. Just like Indiana, Iowa State is historically a losing program. However, head coach Matt Campbell has been able to build them up as of the last few years, and they have become a contender in the Big 12. They seem to be everyone's favorite story in college football, and this year, many people thought they were a dark horse playoff contender. However, that's not what happened, as in week 1, they almost lost to Northern Iowa, and that pretty much exposed them. Then the following week, they got embarrassed by in-state rival Iowa, and this pretty much summed up how the season was going to go, as instead of being a playoff contender or a contender in the Big 12 like they've been the past few years, they ended up going 7-6 with a loss in the Cheez-It Bowl to Clemson. Next up, Florida. In 2020, the Gators had a great season, winning the SEC East for the first time since 2016 and beating Georgia also for the first time since 2016. The Gators made the SEC championship game and actually pushed Alabama and were competitive with them, but got killed in their bowl game against Oklahoma. Despite the great year, a lot of people were still questionable about Dan Mullen and how Florida managed to lose their last 3 games of the season. As we all know, at the end of the regular season, DeMarco Wilson threw that LSU player's shoe, and that cost them the game against LSU and cost them at any hopes of making the college football playoff. And then, of course, the loss to Alabama, and then the blowout loss to Oklahoma. Despite losing Kyle Trask and many of the other notable stars the Florida Gators had in 2020, the Gators started the year off ranked at number 11 and were expected to be a contender in the SEC East like every other year. And they would start off 2-0 with easy blowout wins over Florida Atlantic and South Florida, but would almost knock off the number 2 ranked team in the country and defending national champions, the Alabama Crimson Tide. This was huge and almost felt more like a win for the Gators than a loss. And then the following week, they blew out Tennessee and were 3-1 on the season, and it looked like Florida was going to do pretty good in 2021. But then the following week, they went on the road and lost to Kentucky, which is unacceptable for Florida. And despite their easy shutout win over Vanderbilt, they would then lose to LSU on the road, and they get blown out by Georgia in their rivalry game, 34-7. And then the following week would then get killed by South Carolina, 40-17. Then the next week, they were actually behind against Samford, an FCS team who wasn't even a good FCS team, but still managed to win that game 70-52. But then went on the road and lost to Missouri on a 2-point conversion, which is what finally got Dan Mullen canned. Although Florida still had hopes to make a bowl game, which they did. They beat in-state rival Florida State and made the Gasparilla Bowl against in-state Group of 5 team UCF, who ended up beating Florida in the Gasparilla Bowl, and Florida finished the year overall at a very disappointing 6-7 record. At number 2, I have North Carolina. Back in 2020, the Tar Heels made a ton of noise, going 8-4 and making the Orange Bowl, being one of the better teams in the ACC, being a major contender. Going into 2021, there was a ton of hype surrounding North Carolina football. Everyone thought they were the next blue blood in college football like Clemson, and that they were on the rise and would be a major contender for the ACC and might even be able to push Clemson in the ACC and win the ACC championship. There was a ton of hype around quarterback Sam Howell, who many people thought was a Heisman contender. However, in week 1, the Tar Heels got exposed against a terrible Virginia Tech team, losing that game 17-10. Although 2 weeks later, they did actually manage to blow out Virginia. However, they then got blown out by a terrible 3-9 Georgia Tech team. Although they did manage to blow out in-state rival Duke 38-7. But then lost at home to a terrible Florida State team. And then at the end of the regular season, choked bad against NC State in the last few minutes of the game, and then got killed by South Carolina in the Duke's Mayo Bowl, and Sam Howell's last ever career game as a Tar Heel. UNC finished the year overall at a 6-7 record, which is Mack Brown's first losing record in his 3 years at Chapel Hill. Texas, just like going into every other year, or going into 2021 ranked and hyped up, and like every other year, everyone thought this would finally be the year, as they were under new head coach Steve Sarkisian, who had been the offense coordinator at Alabama under Nick Saban and had been the head coach at both Washington and Southern Cal. And Texas started off all right, going 3-0, but then got blown out by Arkansas, and that pretty much summed up how the year was going to be for Texas. And then lost at home to Kansas for the first time in program history, and finished the year 5-7, missing a bowl game. Steve Sarkisian is in the hot seat going into this season only after 1 year at Texas. But Texas is overall the #1 most disappointing college football team from the 2021 college football season. But that's all for this video. Please subscribe and comment what video you think I should do next. Please like and subscribe and share with your friends.